She didn't wake up that morning thinking her life was about to change. She woke up the way she always did, quietly, carefully, trying not to disturb a house that already felt like it was held together by the thinnest possible thread. She made breakfast with what was left. She counted what was in her purse. She looked at her daughter's shoes and noticed again that the left one was starting to come apart at the sole. And then she picked up the résumé she had printed the night before at the library because their home printer had been out of ink for months, and she told herself that today was the day something was going to change. She had no idea how right she was. She had no idea that by the time that afternoon was over, the entire architecture of the life she thought she was living would be gone. Every wall, every floor, every ceiling, gone. This is the story of a woman named Rachel, and it begins not with a courtroom, not with a lawyer, and not with revenge, though all of those things are coming. It begins with a Tuesday morning, a printed résumé, a little girl named Lily holding her mother's hand, and a door to a restaurant that Rachel almost didn't push open. What happened on the other side of that door is the kind of thing that people who were there that day still talk about, not because it was loud, not because anyone screamed, but because of what Rachel did, slowly, deliberately, and with absolute precision, in the next 60 minutes, and then what she did in the 60 days after that. This is not a story about a woman who fell apart. This is a story about a woman who had already quietly, methodically put herself back together, before anyone in that room even realized she had broken. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments right now. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community all around the world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel are the ones that most people keep quiet, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. To understand what happened in that restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, you have to go back further. You have to go back to the beginning of Rachel and Marcus, because the story of how they ended is completely inseparable from the story of how they started. They met in their mid-20s, at a birthday party for a mutual friend, the kind of casual, crowded apartment gathering where nobody expects to meet someone significant. But Rachel noticed Marcus immediately, not because he was the loudest in the room, which he was not, but because he was one of the few people who was actually listening when someone else spoke. He had that quality, early on, of making you feel like you were the most important person in whatever room you were in. People who knew him then described him as magnetic, attentive, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and asked follow-up questions about things you mentioned weeks ago. Rachel fell in love with that version of Marcus, and for a while, a good while, he was genuinely that man. They married 3 years after that party. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony with family and close friends, a backyard reception in late summer, and a honeymoon weekend 2 states over because that was what they could afford at the time. And that was fine with Rachel because she was not a woman who needed extravagance. What she needed was honesty. What she needed was partnership. And in the early years of their marriage, she believed she had both. They both worked. They split the bills. They made decisions together. When Rachel got pregnant with Lily, they sat at the kitchen table and mapped out a budget, talked about childcare, talked about what the next few years would look like. That kind of planning, that kind of transparency, it felt like the foundation of something solid. It felt like the beginning of something real. What Rachel did not know, what she could not have known, was that Marcus had already begun to live 2 versions of his life simultaneously. And only one of those versions included her. The shift happened gradually, the way the most important shifts always do. It didn't announce itself. There was no single day Rachel could point to and say, that was the morning everything changed. Instead, it came in small pieces. A changed password on his laptop. Fewer details offered about his day. A promotion he mentioned almost as an afterthought. A new client he was vague about. She noticed these things in the way that people who love someone notice things, with more curiosity than suspicion, always extending the benefit of the doubt, always finding the most generous interpretation of the evidence in front of her. That is the particular cruelty of what Marcus was doing. He was counting on her decency. He was using her goodness as a tool. Because a woman who trusts you completely, who does not snoop through your phone or audit your bank accounts or cross-reference your stories, a woman like that is the perfect cover. And Marcus knew exactly what he had in Rachel. The money conversation started about 18 months before the restaurant. Marcus sat her down one evening and told her that work was going through a rough patch. A contract hadn't been renewed. A client had pulled out. Things were tight, he said, and they were going to need to tighten up for a while. Rachel believed him without hesitation. Of course she did. She had never had reason not to, so she adjusted. She stopped buying certain things. She started meal planning with painful precision, building grocery lists around sales and coupons, cutting proteins down to twice a week, and stretching everything else as far as it could go. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself this was what marriage looked like in the hard seasons. You hold each other up, you pull back where you can, and you come out the other side stronger. She held on to that story for 18 months. 18 months of counting change, of turning down invitations because she couldn't afford them, of watching Lily outgrow shoes she couldn't replace fast enough. 18 months of believing a lie that was being told to her, deliberately and consistently, by the one person on earth she had decided to trust with everything. What Rachel did not know, what took her breath away when she finally learned it, was that Marcus's income had not gone down. It had gone up. Significantly. Somewhere around the time he told her money was tight, he had been brought in on a new consulting arrangement that dramatically increased what he was taking home every month. The numbers were not even close. While Rachel was skipping her own meals so that Lily could eat enough, Marcus was depositing more money in a single month than he had previously made in 3. The financial picture he had shown her, the stressed, belt-tightening, rough patch version of their household was entirely constructed. Every detail of it was a deliberate choice. And while he was building that false picture for Rachel at home, he was building something else entirely, somewhere else, with someone else. He had been careful about it. The second phone. The calendar entries she couldn't see. The restaurant tabs paid in cash. But there is a limit to how long a person can hold 2 lives apart, no matter how organized they are, no matter how practiced the deception. And Marcus was about to reach that limit on a Tuesday afternoon he had not planned for. Rachel had heard about the restaurant from a woman at Lily's school pickup, a newer place, upscale but not impossible to get a job at, apparently hearing for front-of-house positions. Rachel wasn't looking for a career. She was looking for something to help cover what Marcus kept telling her they didn't have. She wanted to bring something in. She wanted to not feel helpless anymore. So she put together her resume, asked a neighbor to watch Lily for an hour, then changed her mind and brought Lily with her, thinking it might be a shorter trip than she expected. She dressed in the best things she owned that still fit properly. She did her hair. She told Lily they were going somewhere nice, made it sound like an outing, something to look forward to. They took the bus because the car needed gas and she was watching every dollar. They got off at the stop nearest the restaurant, walked the half block, and Rachel reached for the door handle. And then she pulled it open and stepped inside and stopped walking. The restaurant was everything she had not been living inside for 18 months. Warm golden lighting, white tablecloths, the soft sound of piano being piped through speakers, people dining in the comfortable, unhurried way that people dine when money is not something they think about during dinner. And Rachel stood at the entrance, taking all of this in, when something in her peripheral vision registered, a posture she recognized, a way of holding a fork, a laugh she had been hearing for almost a decade. She turned her head slowly toward a booth near the far wall, and there was Marcus, dressed well, relaxed in a way she had not seen him relaxed in a very long time, and across from him, leaning toward him, was a woman who was not Rachel, who had never met Rachel, who, based on the way she was looking at Marcus, did not appear to know that Rachel existed at all. Rachel stood at the door of that restaurant for what witnesses later described as only about 10 seconds, though she would say afterward that it felt much longer than that. Long enough for something to move through her, not rage, not collapse, but something slower and colder and more deliberate than either of those things. Long enough for something to click into place. Long enough for a year and a half of skipped meals and expired coupons and Lily's broken shoe, and the neighbor's printer and the bus ride and the resume in her hand to suddenly, completely, make sense. She looked down at Lily, who was looking up at her mother with the alert, watchful expression of a child who does not yet understand what she is in the middle of but knows that something real is happening. And Rachel reached down, took Lily's hand, and walked toward that booth. Not fast, not slow. like she had a reservation. The other woman, whose name Rachel would later learn was Diane, noticed Rachel first. There was a brief, confused moment where Diane's expression shifted from warmth to uncertainty, because Rachel was walking directly toward them with an expression that was unreadable and completely calm. Marcus looked up a second later, and the color left his face in a way that witnesses at nearby tables said was instantaneous. Total. He opened his mouth. Rachel pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She placed her purse on the table. She settled Lily into the seat beside her. She reached across and picked up the menu, and then she began to read it. Quietly. Thoroughly. Like she had all the time in the world. Like she had planned to be there for dinner all along, and the booth went completely silent. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Diane looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at the menu. Lily, sensing the strange gravity of the moment, stayed quiet beside her mother, watching with her large, serious eyes. Other diners had begun to notice. A waiter approached uncertainly, glancing between the three adults at the table, reading the room with the quick professional instinct of someone who has learned to recognize when something beneath the surface of a table is not what it appears. Rachel looked up from the menu, caught his eye, and smiled with the kind of composure that made him believe, momentarily, that perhaps this was a perfectly ordinary dinner for four. She ordered the appetizer she had been eyeing. She ordered the entree. She asked about the pasta and listened attentively to the explanation. She ordered Lily a juice and a meal from the children's section. And then she looked up at the waiter and said, quietly and clearly, that her husband would be taking care of the bill, that they were family. And she smiled again and looked back at her menu. What happened in the next few minutes after that is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Diane reached for her coat. There was no confrontation, no shouting, just the quiet, dawning understanding in Diane's expression that she was somewhere she should not be, in the presence of something she had not been fully aware of. She left. And then it was just Marcus and Rachel and Lily in that booth, with the food beginning to arrive, and Marcus leaning forward and starting to speak in the low, urgent, careful voice of a man who understands, for the first time in a very long time, that he is completely out of moves. He started with the apology. Rachel let him finish. He moved to the explanation, the relationship with Diane, how long it had been going on, how it had started. Rachel listened. She ate. She cut Lily's food for her. And then Marcus, perhaps because he had no other card left to play, perhaps because the honesty that had been absent from their marriage for 18 months suddenly felt like his only remaining asset, began to talk about the money. He told her about the consulting arrangement. He told her the real numbers. He told her about the account she had not known existed, the one where the additional income had been going. He told her about the spending. Some of it he could barely bring himself to say out loud. And Rachel sat across from him and listened to the full financial portrait of a life that had been hidden from her, piece by piece, in the same house, at the same kitchen table where she had been counting grocery money and skipping her own dinner. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She let him talk, and when he was done, he reached across the table and said that he wanted to fix it, that he was sorry, that he knew it was going to take time, but that he wanted them to try, that he would change. He used the word promise 3 times in 60 seconds, and Rachel looked at him across that white tablecloth in the warm light of a restaurant she had never been to before and said something quietly that the tables around them could not quite hear. Then she looked at the dessert menu. And she ordered too. What Marcus interpreted as forgiveness in that booth was something else entirely. Something he would not understand until much later, until he came home one Tuesday, a few weeks after that dinner, and found the house quieter than he had ever heard it. Not the quiet of an empty afternoon. The permanent quiet of a space that has been organized and vacated by someone who knew exactly what they were taking and what they were leaving behind. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment. He walked through the rooms. He called her name. There was no answer. And on the kitchen counter, held down by the set of car keys she had left behind because she had taken the other set, the one he had never thought to watch, was a letter. Not from Rachel, from her attorney. In the weeks between the restaurant and that Tuesday, Rachel had not been sitting still. She had not been waiting. She had not been deciding whether to stay or whether to go. That decision had been made at the table, in the silence before she ordered dessert. What she had been doing in the days after that dinner was working, quietly, methodically, with the focused efficiency of a woman who has finally been told the truth and intends to use every word of it. The financial information Marcus had volunteered in that booth, the account numbers he referenced, the income figures he confessed, the assets he described, had been absorbed and retained with an accuracy that he had not anticipated because he had mistaken her composure for passivity. She had not been composing herself. She had been memorizing. She had been building. The attorney Rachel hired had handled cases like this before, not exactly like this, but close enough. Spouses who had hidden income. Spouses who had constructed a version of their household finances that bore no resemblance to reality. Spouses who had used the other person's trust as a financial instrument, keeping them economically dependent and informationally blind for years at a time. The legal term for what Marcus had done was not complicated. It was financial fraud within a marriage. And the confession he had delivered voluntarily at dinner, on his credit card, in front of witnesses, that confession was the foundation of everything that came next. What he had given her that night was not just the truth. He had given her the blueprint of his own deception, detailed and time-stamped in his own words. And now that blueprint was in the hands of someone who knew exactly what to do with it. The legal process that followed was not instant, and it was not simple, but it moved with a clarity that surprised even Rachel's attorney. Because Marcus had disclosed so much of his own financial picture voluntarily, and because those disclosures could be matched and verified against actual account records, tax filings, and income documentation, there was very little room to maneuver. When a spouse hides assets during a marriage and is caught, courts do not treat it lightly. Depending on the jurisdiction, judges have the authority to award a significantly larger share of marital assets to the spouse who was deceived, in some cases up to 100% of the hidden assets themselves. Attorneys' fees can be ordered against the deceptive party. And in situations where the financial concealment rises to the level of fraud or deliberate misrepresentation, the legal consequences extend far beyond the simple division of property. Marcus had not consulted a lawyer before confessing at dinner. That was his most expensive mistake. Rachel and Lily moved into a small apartment about 20 minutes from where they had lived. It was nothing spectacular. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, enough light in the mornings to feel like a fresh start, which was the thing Rachel said she cared about most when she chose it. The settlement gave her financial stability she had not had in years, not wealth, not overnight transformation, but a real foundation. Spousal support. Child support calculated against Marcus's actual income, not the fictional lower income he had been describing to her at home. A portion of the assets he had accumulated during the marriage, including the account he had thought she would never find out about. She did not spend it recklessly. She did not broadcast what she had. She put a portion of it away for Lily's future, paid off the debts that had accumulated during the 18 months she had been stretched tight, and used the rest to rebuild slowly, carefully, the way someone builds when they finally understand that they cannot rely on anyone else's version of what their life looks like. She did eventually find work, not at the restaurant she had walked into that afternoon, but somewhere new, something she found on her own, something that was hers in a way that felt different from everything she had done before. People close to her said she was different afterward. Not harder, exactly, still warm, still present, still the kind of person who listened when you spoke, but steadier, clearer about what she would and would not accept. Less willing to interpret someone else's silence as honesty, less willing to mistake someone else's comfort for her own security. She said, months later, in a conversation with someone she trusted, that the strangest part of the whole experience was gratitude. Not gratitude to Marcus, not gratitude for the betrayal, but gratitude for the accident of the job listing. Gratitude for the fact that she had brought Lily with her that afternoon instead of leaving her with the neighbor. Gratitude that she had pushed that door open instead of standing on the sidewalk and convincing herself to come back another day. Because here is what Rachel said, and this is the part that stays with you, the part that the people who know her story repeat when they tell it to others. She said that if she had not walked through that door, she might have kept waiting, kept believing the version of their financial life that Marcus was constructing for her. Kept skipping meals, kept stretching the grocery budget, kept telling herself that the hard season was almost over, that her husband was going to come through, that the man she married was still somewhere inside the man she was living with. She might have waited another year, another 2 years, while Marcus spent the money on a life she was not part of, in restaurants she had never been to, with a woman whose name she did not know. She had been living inside a story that someone else was writing for her, and she had needed to accidentally walk through a door to realize it. There is something in this story that goes beyond one marriage and one restaurant and one Tuesday afternoon. There is something in it that speaks to a particular kind of pain, the kind that doesn't come from a stranger, doesn't arrive without warning, doesn't look the way damage is supposed to look. The kind that wears the face of someone you chose, someone you made breakfast for and built a life with, and believed when they told you the world looked a certain way. That kind of pain is its own particular category, and the people who have survived it will tell you, as Rachel will tell you, that the hardest part is not the moment of discovery. The hardest part is the recalibration, the slow, difficult work of learning to trust your own perception again after someone you loved spent years teaching you to override it. That work is not dramatic. It does not happen in a restaurant booth. It happens quietly, over months, in an apartment with good morning light, with a child doing homework at the kitchen table, with a refrigerator that is finally, simply, full. Marcus, by every account from people who knew the situation, spent a long time trying to understand what had happened to him. He had believed that dinner was a turning point. He had believed that honesty, offered at the right moment, was the same thing as being forgiven. He had not understood, and perhaps still does not, that what Rachel had seen in that restaurant was not just a man having dinner with another woman. She had seen the entire shape of the deception. The money, the silence, the constructed poverty, the carefully maintained performance of a struggling marriage while he dined on credit cards she didn't know existed. She had seen all of it, in that one moment, with a clarity that only betrayal at that scale can produce. And she had chosen, not in the heat of it, not with tears and accusations, but with a cold, quiet, complete deliberateness, to stop building her future on his foundation. She built her own, and the last thing anyone who knows Rachel will tell you is this: she doesn't talk about Marcus often, and when she does, it is not with bitterness. It is with something more like detachment. The kind of detachment that comes when a chapter is genuinely closed, not suppressed, not avoided, but actually finished. She talks about Lily, who is doing well. She talks about the work she has found, which she is good at. She talks about the mornings in the apartment with the good light, and the full refrigerator, and the life she is building on ground that no one else controls. And sometimes, when someone asks her what she learned from all of it, from the 18 months of constructed poverty, from the restaurant, from the booth, from the letter on the kitchen counter, she pauses. And then she says something quiet, the same thing she has said more than once. She says, "He taught me what I was worth by showing me exactly what he thought I was worth, and those two numbers were very different. I just needed to find the door." So here is the question this story leaves behind, and it is not a simple one. We talk a lot about betrayal as if it is always visible, as if there is always a warning sign we missed, a red flag we chose not to see, a moment of doubt we overrode out of convenience. But what about the betrayals that are designed specifically to be invisible? What about the ones that rely on your trust as the mechanism, that use your goodness against you, that need your faith in order to function? What do we owe ourselves in those situations before we reach the restaurant, before we accidentally push the right door, before something outside our control hands us the evidence we would never have thought to look for? How many people are sitting right now inside a version of events that someone else constructed for them, counting money that should not be scarce, waiting for a season to end that was never going to end on its own, because they are extending to someone else the faith they were never asked to verify? That is the question. Drop your answer in the comments below. We want to know what you think. Was Rachel right to take everything and leave without ever confronting him again after that Tuesday? Or do you think he deserved a real conversation, a second chance, an honest try? Tell us. And tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, your state, your country right there in the comments. This community is growing every week, and we love seeing where our family is watching from. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button right now. Because next week's story is already waiting, and it is the kind of story that makes this one feel like the introduction. We'll see you there. Stay close.